The room was dark, permeated by the sharp, sterile scent of chlorine and something else, something cloyingly sweet and unsettlingly familiar. I was lying on a surface that yielded softly beneath my weight, my muscles humming with the pleasant ache of exertion. A touch, feather-light and deliberate, was ghosting over my skin. It traced a path from the hollow of my collarbone down into the valley between my breasts, and my body arched into it instinctively, still caught in the hazy, languid aftermath of a pleasure so profound it had unmoored me from reality. The fingers were confident yet gentle, moving with an unnerving intimacy, like a cartographer charting a land they already knew by heart. I surfaced slowly from the fog of sleep, my limbs heavy and my mind sluggish. My eyelids fluttered open, struggling to focus on the ceiling above me. It was a blank, unfamiliar expanse of white, textured in a pattern I had never seen before. That single, simple detail was enough to send a jolt through my system, a cold spike of adrenaline that cut through the lingering warmth in my veins. Panic began to bloom like a cold flower in my chest, its icy petals unfurling as I tried to reconcile the sensuous memory of the last few hours with the stark, terrifying fact of my dislocation. The gentle hand on my skin suddenly felt less like a caress and more like a cage. Just hours earlier, the world had been an entirely different place, a brightly lit arena of controlled effort and public scrutiny. The gym was a cacophony of rhythmic grunts, the percussive clank of steel, and the muffled thumping of a generic pop song. At 45, I felt like an intruder in this temple of youth and discipline. My body, which had carried me through life, suddenly felt like a soft, unwritten apology amidst the chiseled physiques that moved with such effortless confidence around me. I felt every soft curve, every sign of gravity's pull, as a mark of failure in a place that worshipped only taut, unyielding perfection. It was then that I first saw her, my new trainer. She was everything I was not. She moved through the maze of machinery with the fluid economy of a predator, her body a testament to unwavering discipline. Every muscle was visible beneath the thin fabric of her workout clothes, a living sculpture of strength and control. She was younger, radiating a self-assurance that was both captivating and deeply intimidating. I watched her as she corrected another client's form, her movements precise and economical, and I felt a strange and complicated pang in my chest, a mixture of raw admiration, sharp envy, and a longing so profound it felt like a physical ache. This longing was a disquieting sensation, an internal tremor that I couldn't name or dismiss. It wasn't purely aspirational, a simple desire to have a body like hers. It was something more primal, a pull toward the very essence of her being, her power, her unapologetic presence. She represented a version of life, of womanhood, that felt entirely alien to my own carefully constructed, quiet existence. To want what she had felt like a betrayal of who I was, yet the feeling persisted, a low hum beneath the surface of my consciousness as I waited for my session to begin, feeling both exposed and invisible under the harsh fluorescent lights. Her previous client finished, and as the trainer turned, her gaze swept across the room and landed on me. For a moment that stretched into an eternity, the noise of the gym seemed to fade into a dull roar. Her eyes were clear and piercing, and the look she gave me was not the detached professional assessment I had expected. It was direct, appraising, and held a flicker of something else, a cool, predatory curiosity that seemed to strip away my layers of clothing and self-consciousness, seeing something raw and vulnerable beneath. A chill, entirely unrelated to the gym's air conditioning, traced a path down my spine. She walked toward me, her stride unbroken, her eyes never leaving mine. Each step she took seemed to shrink the cavernous space of the gym, pulling me into a tightening circle of focus where only the two of us existed. I felt my posture shift, a subconscious desire to both shrink away and stand taller under the intensity of her approach. It felt less like the beginning of a professional training session and more like a fated, inevitable encounter, as if this moment had been waiting for me since I first walked through the gym's glass doors, seeking to reshape my body, oblivious to the fact that I was about to risk reshaping my entire life. And now, waking in this dark, unfamiliar room, that moment felt like a lifetime ago. The chlorine scent was the only thread connecting that bright, public space to this dark, private one. The gentle, knowing touch continued its exploration of my body, and the panic in my chest solidified into a cold, hard knot of terror. The question was not just where I was, but who I was with, and how the professional distance of a gym had dissolved into this terrifying, inescapable intimacy. My body remembered a pleasure my mind couldn't place, and in the darkness, I was utterly, completely lost. The session began with a semblance of normality, a sterile professionalism that I clung to like a life raft. She demonstrated the first exercise, her movements clean and efficient, her voice a calm, even timbre as she explained the mechanics of muscle engagement. I mirrored her actions, my own body feeling clumsy and hesitant in comparison. The familiar scent of sanitized rubber and metal filled the air, a scent I had always associated with disciplined self-improvement, but which now seemed charged with a new, unspoken potential. She watched me, her gaze analytical, and for a few minutes I allowed myself to believe this would be nothing more than a workout. The illusion shattered during the first set of squats. As I lowered myself, she moved behind me, her presence a sudden, warm weight in my personal space. Her hands settled on my waist, ostensibly to guide my hips and correct my form, but her fingers were spread wide, her palms pressing firmly against me, and her thumbs rested just at the crest of my hips, perilously close to the soft skin of my lower back. "Lower," she murmured, her voice no longer a public instruction, but a private whisper close to my ear. Her breath was warm against my neck, and an involuntary shiver traced its way down my spine, a response that had nothing to do with muscular exertion. We moved from one machine to the next, and with each new exercise, the boundaries blurred further. While I was performing bent-over rows, she stood beside me, one hand placed firmly on my lower back to ensure it remained straight. The pressure was constant, a brand of heat that seemed to seep through my shirt and into my skin. Her other hand would occasionally drift, brushing against my arm to adjust its angle, tracing the line of my shoulder blade. Her touch always lingering a fraction of a second longer than necessary. I tried to focus on the cold, hard weight in my hand, but my entire awareness was consumed by the heat of her palm against my back. Her hands were a study in contrasts. They were strong, the palms calloused from her own dedicated work, yet her fingers were long and deft, moving with a surgeon's precision. When she adjusted my grip on a dumbbell, her fingers would wrap around my own, a brief electric moment of skin on skin that sent a jolt through my arm. These were the hands of a professional, I told myself, hands that understood anatomy and leverage. But the way they moved over me felt less like a clinical correction and more like a deliberate, sensuous exploration, mapping the contours of a body she was just beginning to claim. My own body was a traitor, responding to her proximity with a will of its own. My breathing grew shallow whenever she drew near, my pulse quickening its rhythm. A faint flush crept up my neck, a betraying warmth that I hoped she wouldn't notice. I was caught in a disorienting vortex of confusion and a strange, nascent excitement. Part of my mind screamed that this was wrong, a violation of professional ethics, while another, quieter part, a part I hadn't heard from in years, was captivated, leaning into the intoxicating danger of her attention. I was a passive participant in a game whose rules I didn't understand, and my silence was its own form of consent. The air around us grew thick and heavy, charged with an unspoken tension. The ambient noise of the gym seemed to recede, creating an intimate bubble that enveloped just the two of us. Her instructions became softer, more fragmented, her voice a low murmur that vibrated through the points where our bodies connected. I could smell the faint, clean scent of her soap mixed with the honest musk of exertion, a combination that was dizzyingly personal. She was no longer just a trainer. She had become a physical presence, a constant source of heat and pressure that was systematically dismantling my defenses. During a set of planks, she knelt beside me on the mat, her face just inches from mine as she counted down the seconds. Her eyes, which I had previously found merely piercing, now held a different quality. They were dark and intense, and they weren't looking at my form. They were looking at me. They searched my face, watching for a reaction, for a flicker of fear or desire. I held her gaze, my body trembling with the strain of the exercise, but it was the intensity of her stare that threatened to make me collapse. The final seconds ticked away in a silence that was louder than any sound. The workout was nearing its end, but the tension had only coiled tighter. The final phase was stretching, a necessary conclusion to cool down the muscles. She led me to a more secluded corner of the gym, away from the main floor, where mats were laid out in front of a wall of mirrors. The simple act of moving to this more private space felt significant, a deliberate transition from the public performance of fitness to something else entirely. The air here felt stiller, the light softer, and my sense of anticipation was almost unbearable. She instructed me to sit on the mat and extend one leg. Instead of simply telling me what to do, she knelt in front of me, taking my foot in her hands and placing it against her own thigh. Her touch was firm, grounding me to the floor. As she gently pushed my torso forward to deepen the stretch, her other hand rested on the small of my back, her finger splayed, a familiar point of heat and pressure. She held me in the stretch, her body a warm and solid counterweight to my own, her proximity so complete that I could feel the slight rise and fall of her chest with each breath. For the final stretch, she had me lie on my back, and she lifted my legs straight into the air. She stood over me, her body a powerful silhouette against the gym lights. She held my leg high, her hands wrapped around my calf, and slowly pressed it toward my chest. Her face was directly above mine, her expression unreadable but intense. From this angle, I was completely vulnerable, my body pliant and yielding under her expert hands. I could feel the pull in my hamstring, a deep, satisfying ache, but it was overshadowed by the overwhelming intimacy of her position, of her control. It was then that my eyes drifted to the mirror on the wall beside us. The reflection threw the scene into sharp, undeniable relief. It wasn't a trainer helping a client. It was an image of startling intimacy. One woman standing over another, their bodies entwined in a pose of complete trust and surrender. I saw the way her fingers were pressed into my skin, the way my own body was arched slightly toward her. I looked away from our bodies and met my own eyes in the mirror, wide with a mixture of shock and dawning awareness. Then I shifted my gaze in the reflection and met hers. She was already looking, not at my leg or my form, but directly at me in the mirror. The professional mask was completely gone. In its place was a look of raw, undisguised intent, a clear and unambiguous acknowledgement of the electric current that had been building between us for the last hour. Her eyes held mine, and in that silent, mirrored moment, a question was asked and an answer was given without a single word being spoken. The air left my lungs in a rush. and I knew with absolute certainty that the workout was over, but something else was just beginning. "You need to cool down properly." Her voice was low, cutting through the residual haze of our mirrored gaze. The words themselves were innocuous, a standard part of any training regimen. Yet, coming from her, at this precise moment, they were laden with a meaning that had nothing to do with muscle recovery. It was a suggestion, but it felt like a summons. I felt a sense of relief that the public performance was over, mixed with a thrumming anxiety for the private one that was about to begin. She held out a hand, not to me, but in a gesture toward the locker room, and I rose from the mat, my legs feeling strangely unsteady. The walk from the stretching area to the women's locker room was the longest journey of my life. The sounds of the gym, the clanking weights, the whirring of treadmills faded behind us with each step, replaced by the soft squeak of our sneakers on the polished floor. She walked slightly ahead of me, not looking back, her confidence a magnetic force that pulled me along in her wake. I was simply following, a silent and willing participant in a script I had not written, but was suddenly desperate to see through to its conclusion. The act of placing one foot in front of the other felt like a series of small, irretrievable surrenders. The locker room was empty, a cavern of white tiles and metal doors that amplified the sound of the door hissing shut behind us. The air was cool and thick with the clean, antiseptic smell of chlorine. Our footsteps echoed in the stillness, a stark contrast to the energetic pulse of the gym floor. It was a sterile, functional space, yet in its emptiness, it felt profoundly intimate, a private sanctuary sealed off from the outside world. Here, there were no mirrors reflecting our actions back to us, no prying eyes, only rows of silent lockers standing as witnesses. She didn't pause at the lockers or benches. Instead, she led me to the far end of the room, to a small, matted area I had never noticed before, tucked away in an alcove. "One final stretch," she said, her voice a soft command that brooked no argument. It was a plausible pretext, a final thread of professionalism to which I could cling, even as I knew it was unraveling. She gestured for me to sit, and I obeyed, my movements feeling slow and dreamlike. The atmosphere was charged, every small action feeling momentous and irreversible. She knelt before me, taking my right leg and gently placing my foot on her shoulder, a position far more intimate than any we had held on the gym floor. My body was open to her, vulnerable. Her face was inches from my thigh, her hair brushing against my skin as she instructed me to lean forward. I could see the faint constellation of freckles across her nose, the focused intensity in her eyes as she watched not my form, but my face. The stretch itself was a distant sensation, a dull ache in my hamstring that was completely overshadowed by the electric proximity of our bodies. Her hand rested on my bent knee, a seemingly innocent point of contact. Then, slowly, with an agonizing deliberation, it began to move. Her fingers traced a path up the inside of my thigh, the slight roughness of her calluses a startling contrast to the softness of my skin. My breath hitched in my throat, a sharp, involuntary intake of air. Every instinct, every rule of social conduct I had ever learned screamed at me to pull away, to stop this, to say something. But my body was a stone, my voice trapped in my throat, paralyzed by a potent cocktail of fear and a desire so fierce it terrified me. I was frozen, suspended in a moment of pure, terrifying clarity. My mind was a whirlwind of conflict, a silent, frantic debate between years of conditioning and the raw, undeniable pull of this forbidden connection. I could feel the frantic beat of my own heart against my ribs, a wild bird trapped in a cage. My silence was my answer. In the absence of a no, My stillness became a resounding yes, an unspoken permission that hung in the air between us, as tangible as the scent of chlorine. She never broke eye contact. Her eyes were fixed on mine, watching, reading, gauging my reaction to her transgression. She saw the conflict in my expression, the fear, but she must have also seen the flicker of yielding, the subtle surrender. She was not just acting, she was testing me, pushing the boundary 1 millimeter at a time. An expert strategist waiting for the precise moment her opponent's defenses would crumble. Her confidence was absolute, as if she knew the outcome before the game had even begun. Her fingers reached the hem of my shorts, the thin barrier of fabric, the last line of defense. They paused there, a silent, final question. The pressure of her fingertips against my skin was a brand, a point of focus in a world that was rapidly dissolving into pure sensation. This was the precipice, the point of no return. The choice was mine, stark and simple. Stop this now or let it consume me. The seconds stretched into an eternity, filled with the sound of my own ragged breathing. In that extended moment of stillness, a decision was made. It wasn't a conscious thought, but a deeper, more primal acceptance. I did not move. I did not speak. I simply remained, pliant and breathless, under her touch. A wave of something akin to relief washed over me, the quiet release that comes from finally ceasing to fight against an overwhelming tide. I was surrendering, and in that surrender, I felt a strange and terrifying sense of liberation. A subtle shift occurred in her expression. The intense focus softened, replaced by a look of bark, triumphant understanding. She had her answer. Her hand moved from my thigh, and for a fleeting, panicked moment, I thought she was retreating. But she only shifted her position slightly, her movements fluid and unhurried. The silent contract had been sealed. She rose to her feet in a single, graceful motion, her eyes still locked on mine. She offered me a hand to help me up, and the simple contact of her palm against mine sent a fresh jolt of electricity through me. She didn't release my hand. Instead, she turned, gently pulling me with her. With a slight nod of her head, she indicated the direction of the showers at the very back of the locker room, and without a word, I followed. The door to the shower stall clicked shut behind us, a soft, definitive sound that sealed us off from the rest of the world. She turned the chrome handle, and the water sputtered to life, first a cold trickle, then a steady, hissing spray. It was the only sound in the small, tiled enclosure, a white noise that immediately began to fill the space, erasing the echoes of the locker room and creating a new, isolated reality for just the two of us. I stood motionless, watching the water beat against the opposite wall, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. A cloud of hot steam began to fill the stall, billowing from the floor up, instantly fogging the glass door. It rose like a curtain, obscuring the hard, sterile lines of the tiles and softening the single, harsh light from above. The air grew warm and humid, clinging to my skin, making the already damp fabric of my workout clothes feel heavy and oppressive. This misty veil was a blessing, a shield that made me feel both hidden and intensely exposed, heightening every sense except for sight. I watched as she began to undress, her movements unhurried and deliberate. She pulled her tank top over her head in one fluid motion, revealing the sculpted lines of her back and shoulders. Her sports bra followed. Then she hooked her thumbs into the waistband of her leggings and pushed them down, stepping out of them with an easy grace. In the thickening steam, her body was an silhouette of impossible perfection, a living statue carved from discipline and desire. And the sight of her, so utterly uninhibited, was both a shock and an invitation. My own fingers felt clumsy and slow as I followed her lead. I peeled off my sweat-soaked shirt, the fabric sticking to my skin. My shorts felt heavy as I pushed them down over my hips and thighs. Standing there, completely bare for the first time in front of her, I felt a wave of the old insecurity wash over me, a feeling of being soft and undefined next to her athletic form. But as she stepped toward me, the look in her eyes held no judgment, only a raw, undisguised hunger that made my vulnerability feel like a form of power. She closed the small distance between us, and the heat radiating from her skin was a tangible force. She raised her hands, not to touch my body, but to cup my face, her palms warm against my cheeks. Her thumbs gently stroked my jawline as she leaned in, and her lips met mine. The first kiss was tentative, a soft, questioning pressure, but it deepened almost instantly, becoming a hungry, demanding exploration that stole the breath from my lungs. The world dissolved into the taste of her and the sound of the water. The hot spray cascaded over my shoulders and back, a relentless, soothing presence. The water sluiced between our bodies as we pressed closer, plastering her dark hair to her face and neck, making her skin slick and impossibly smooth beneath my tentative touch. It was a sensory overload, the heat of the water, the surprising coolness of the tiled wall behind me, and the overwhelming, intoxicating warmth of her body against mine. Every sensation was amplified, every touch electric. Her hands began to roam, leaving my face to explore the lines of my body with a slow, reverent curiosity. They moved over my shoulders, down my arms, and across the gentle slope of my stomach. There was no rush, no frantic grabbing, only a deliberate, worshipful touch that made me feel as though my body was something precious, something to be discovered. Her palms flattened against my lower back, pulling me flush against her, and I felt the hard planes of her abdomen press into my softer belly. She guided me backward until my shoulders met the cold, wet tiles of the wall. The shock of the cold against my heated skin made me gasp against her mouth. She used the wall as leverage, pressing her body more fully against mine, trapping me between the unyielding surface and her own powerful form. The position was one of complete surrender, my body pinned by hers. It was a primal, possessive act, a silent claiming that sent a fresh wave of heat flooding through my veins, coiling low in my gut. My own hands, which had been resting hesitantly on her waist, grew bolder. I was no longer a passive recipient. I slid them up her back, discovering the corded muscles that flanked her spine, the sharp, elegant angles of her shoulder blades. Her skin was firm and smooth under the running water. I tangled my fingers in her wet hair, holding her head to mine as our kiss grew deeper, more frantic. I was exploring her as she was exploring me, an equal participant in this desperate, silent conversation. Her lips left mine, trailing a searing path down my neck and across my collarbone. One of her hands slid down from my back, moving around to my front, her fingers tracing a line down my sternum and over my ribs. They paused just above my navel before continuing their descent, moving with an agonizing slowness that was both torture and ecstasy. My hips arched involuntarily, a silent plea as her hand brushed against the delicate skin of my inner thigh. The world narrowed to that single point of contact. Her fingers were impossibly gentle, teasing and circling, building a pressure within me that was unbearable. I clung to her, my nails digging into the skin of her shoulders, my head thrown back against the tiles as a low sound escaped my throat, swallowed by the ceaseless drumming of the water. The tension coiled tighter and tighter, a brilliant, searing knot of pleasure that demanded release. And then It came. A wave of sensation so intense it felt like I was shattering from the inside out. It crested and broke, leaving me trembling and breathless, my body limp against hers. My legs felt weak, and I sagged against the wall, held up only by her strong embrace. She held me for a long moment, her lips pressing a soft, final kiss to my shoulder as my ragged breathing slowly returned to normal. We just stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, letting the hot water wash over us, the steam swirling around us like a shroud. We just stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, letting the hot water wash over us, the steam swirling around us like a shroud. A memory of heat and steam was still clinging to me when I surfaced, a lingering echo of pleasure that made my body feel heavy and boneless. I was in a bed, the sheets rougher than my own, and the air held a different scent, not the familiar lavender of my bedroom, but a stale, anonymous odor of dust and old fabric. A dull gray light filtered in from a window I didn't recognize, painting the room in muted, unfamiliar shades. I sat up slowly, my head thick with a disorienting fog, trying to piece together the moments that had led me from the tiled shower stall to this strange, quiet place. A sharp, definitive click echoed in the stillness, and the room was instantly flooded with a brutal, clinical light. I flinched, throwing a hand up to shield my eyes as they burned from the sudden assault. The light was merciless, stripping the room of all its soft shadows and exposing every detail with a harsh, unforgiving clarity. It was a simple, sterile bedroom, furnished with a cheap dresser and a single chair. The abrupt transition from the gentle, hazy dawn to this interrogation room brightness was a physical shock, a violent tearing of the veil that had shrouded my confusion. When my eyes adjusted, the first thing I saw was her, my trainer. She was standing by the door, her hand still on the light switch. She was fully dressed in jeans and a simple t-shirt, her arms crossed over her chest. The person from the gym, the woman whose hands had mapped my body with such intimate knowledge, was gone. In her place stood this impassive stranger, her face a blank mask of professional detachment. The warmth, the hunger, the shared conspiracy of our glances, all of it had vanished, leaving behind a cold, unnerving emptiness in her gaze. Then my eyes shifted past her, and my entire world fractured. Standing beside her, leaning against the doorframe with a casual, relaxed posture, was my husband. He was smiling at me, a calm, placid smile that I knew intimately, the one he used at dinner parties and business meetings. It was a smile completely at odds with the impossible reality of his presence in this room. My mind recoiled, unable to process the two images, the lover from the shower and the husband by the door, standing side by side in the harsh, ugly light. She reached into the pocket of her jeans and produced a small, black object, no bigger than her thumb. She held it out to my husband, her movements economical and devoid of any emotion. He took it from her without a word. My gaze was fixed on the object as it passed between them, and a cold, sickening dread began to crawl up from the pit of my stomach. I recognized it instantly. A tiny, self-contained camera, its cold, unblinking eye of a lens staring back at me like a silent accuser. The floor of my reality gave way. The pieces of the puzzle clicked into place with a horrifying, devastating logic. This hadn't been a seduction. It had been an orchestration. Every touch, every whisper, every shared glance in the mirror had been part of a meticulously staged performance. The gym, the stretching, the shower, all of it had been a carefully constructed set, and I had been its unwitting star. The raw, liberating desire I had felt was nothing more than a Pavlovian response to a stimulus, and my profound moment of surrender had been captured, recorded, and preserved. I looked at my husband, my mind screaming for an explanation, for rage, for jealousy, for any reaction that would make sense. But he just continued to smile, that same placid smile, his eyes holding a look of calm, quiet satisfaction as he pocketed the tiny device. He wasn't the victim of my infidelity. He was its architect. His silence in that moment was louder than any accusation, more damning than any confession. It was the silence of a director watching the final scene of his film, pleased with his actor's performance. I sat frozen on the bed, the rough fabric of the sheet a grounding, abrasive reality against my bare legs. They stood together by the door, a united front, their shared glance a confirmation of a secret alliance to which I was not privy. I was not a participant in a love triangle. I was the project they had worked on together. In that silent, sterile room, I understood that I had been stripped of more than just my clothes. I had been stripped of my will, my agency, my very self, reduced to a mere object of their shared, unfathomable purpose. My husband moved then, breaking the tableau of silent judgment by the door. He did not walk with anger or haste, but with the slow, deliberate grace of a priest approaching an altar. He crossed the small room and knelt on the floor before the bed where I sat, still tangled in the cheap sheets. He didn't speak, didn't offer a single word of explanation or accusation. Instead, he reached behind him and picked up something from the floor that I hadn't noticed, placing it before me on the mattress with a quiet, ceremonial finality. It was a photograph in a simple, unadorned wooden frame. I stared at the image, my mind struggling to comprehend what my eyes were seeing. It was a snapshot of a life I had never known, a life that was running parallel to my own in secret. In the photo, my husband and she, my trainer, were locked in a kiss. It was not a furtive peck, but a deep, intimate kiss, the kind shared between established lovers. They were standing in a park, surrounded by the gold and crimson hues of autumn leaves, and their faces held a look of easy, familiar happiness. It was a picture of a couple profoundly and unapologetically in love. With a hand that trembled uncontrollably, I picked up the frame. The wood was smooth and cool against my skin. I turned it over, driven by a desperate, morbid curiosity to find some clue, some piece of information that would either confirm or deny the insanity that was unfolding. There, burned into the back of the wooden frame, was a neat looping script. It was a short, simple phrase, a loving dedication that served as a final, brutal sentence. The inscription confirmed that this was not a new affair, not a fleeting transgression, but a deep and long-standing bond. My husband rose from his knees, his movements still imbued with that same chilling calm. He walked over to her, taking the tiny black camera from her outstretched hand. He wasn't looking at me. His focus was entirely on the technical task at hand. With precise, practiced movements, he extracted the micro SD card from the camera, a tiny black shard of my soul. He then crossed to the cheap dresser against the wall, upon which sat a digital photo frame, an innocuous piece of household technology that was about to become my personal screen of torment. The small screen flickered to life, its sudden glow the only movement in the suffocatingly still room. The first image to appear was a blur of steam and white tile, a distorted, abstract landscape that my mind recognized with a jolt of nausea. Then the image sharpened and I saw myself. My head was thrown back against the wall of the shower, my eyes were closed, and my face was slack with a pleasure so intense it looked like pain. It was me, but it was not me. It was a character I had played, a stranger whose intimate moments were now being projected for an audience. He returned to the single chair in the room and positioned it directly opposite the bed, then gestured for her to sit. She did, crossing her legs with a casual air of someone settling in to watch a familiar film. My husband then sat on the edge of the bed, not beside me, but angled away, his body turned toward the screen, creating a triangle of spectatorship with me at its unwilling apex. They arranged themselves not as combatants or accusers, but as a quiet, expected audience waiting for the main feature to begin. They did not look at me. They did not acknowledge my physical presence in the room, huddled on the bed less than 10 feet away. Their attention was utterly and completely on the screen, on the silent, flickering images of my surrender. I could have screamed, I could have wept, I could have fled, and I have no doubt it would have made no difference. My actual self had become irrelevant, a ghost in the machine. The only version of me that mattered now was the one trapped behind the glass, performing on a loop for their shared, quiet consumption. I was no longer a wife or a person. I was a piece of media they had created together, a trophy. I sat there, wrapped in a sheet that felt as heavy as a burial shroud, and watched them watch me. They were a couple, sharing an intimate evening, watching a private film to commemorate an anniversary, a ritual I had unwittingly provided the content for. I was a prisoner, bound not by ropes or locked doors, but by the profound, sickening horror of being forced to witness my own erasure, reduced to a silent spectacle in the theater of my own life.